My name is Jeremy NeVilles-Sorell, and I am Anishinaabe and Winnebago. Currently, I live in Duluth, Minnesota. I got into this work with men and boys as a progression of doing violence against women work for 30 years. I got into that work because I grew up in a home witnessing domestic violence and had a lot of regular violence that I saw. And then I experienced sexual abuse as a child or more teenage years, and that stuff never really seemed like that big a priority because of all the domestic violence issues that were going on. So it wasn't that major of a thing. So it was always more concentrated on how do we have healthy families, raise healthy children, have opportunities for children to be who they are, develop in their natural way, without having all these different masks and facade and all these things I had to put up with in order to survive. Because on top of it, lived in an urban area with a lot of crime and violence as well. So not only was it the violence in the home, it's also violence in the community that I had to deal with. So I always felt like growing up, I could never really be who I truly was meant to be. And so getting into this work now, it's odd that it seemed like it took to become an adult before you start to realize your full personality and character of who you truly are. This work is very much important and highly needed because we need to start branching out and providing healing that extends beyond just one segment or one topic in our community, maybe two topics, domestic and sexual violence, largely looking at female victims. The issues around two-spirit victims, which is very high when you look at that particular population. So we still don't have the super high numbers around straight men as being highly victimized. We look at stats and data, it's pretty much the same when you look at abusive things. So when you look at emotional, psychological, mental abuse, controlling issues, all of that stuff, put downs, insults, name calling, even like low level pushing, slapping, those things are pretty much the same for men and women. And whether it's same sex relationships or not, when they start to escalate super high, it drops off for straight men. I don't know how much it changes for same-sex couples, but I know for straight men, it's not the same lethality that happens. But the thing that we're looking at is we don't have an example of what healthy relationships are and what that looks like in our communities. And so we have just a lot of bad relationships that are just normal. People see it as normal. We see people take advantage of people who are passed out. We see this bad behavior, bullying type of behavior, sexual harassment among heterosexual men that starts really young. Giving wedgies, giving people spanking, the hazing stuff in college stuff, spanking with a paddle. You see all this stuff growing up and just dominating, pinning people down. All this type of stuff is like this whole influence of it's sexually related. It's got the sexual tension to it because somehow in our brains we want to be these masculine men, and that's where we get the terms about the toxic masculinity, those type of behaviors that extend out further to. I really think it's about masking and our own insecurity, whether something happened to us or not. And you see guys who are hyper aggressive, very angry, all that stuff. We know that that's a front. We put up fronts in order to be as protective barriers because we don't want to feel vulnerable or people to see us as vulnerable. And that's what happens when we grow up in these homes with a lot of violence and everything else. We want that exterior because we don't want people to see how bad things are. And then when we got the violence in our communities, we have to put up that front so we don't get targeted. Because when we see people who are vulnerable, people will prey on that. And so you have to put up these fronts. And so people hide behind a lot of that. And so that type of trauma extends out over a lifetime. So now you got someone who may have been abused as a little kid and they start turning that abuse on other people, that acting out is behavior because that's what they experience. And they turn around and start doing it to others because it's a way of protecting themselves or a way of trying to understand what happened to themselves. It just goes on, and you just end up with these angry, violent people who are 40, 50, 60 years old and doing all kinds of other things, self-destructive behaviors, or just creating a whole other pile of victims behind them. So it's critical that we bring these issues out and have the conversations and go on these healing journeys. We can provide services all we want, but if we're not working to make meaningful changes for us individuals, then who can make those changes with our families? We're not going to have social change because we're going external. We're relying too much over here and not really having meaningful options for people. So that's what I really like about this work, doing healing and wellness for Native men and boys, because it's an area that hasn't really been addressed yet. And us men need this space to talk about what has happened to us, because if we're not in a helpful place, we're not able to go out and help others in the community or be good members of society. Over the years of doing this work, I see more and more people get more nuanced in how they address the work. When I look back, and in the 70s, it was just very simple. It was, how do you intervene? How do you separate families and relationships? There was not a whole lot of laws happening back then. There was no ability for police to go in homes and arrest people and take out the abusive person. It was more about crisis and getting people to a safe place. That was pretty much it. And that's when you had like crisis, people opening up safe homes. And I know the term changes over the years, like people call shelters safe homes now, but back then, a safe home was a community member's home. Someone who said, you know, I got an extra room, I can take in this family when there's this urgent need. And so the organizing has just developed from that. So there's people getting out of the home. Then you get the stuff in the 90s where people are like, civil protection orders became possible because once people started to leave relationships, what protections happened afterwards? There's always this notion around someone leaves a domestic violence relationship on average 7 times. So the work starts to organize around getting people out and looking for the magic 7th time someone's leaving. But in the experience I had growing up, we were gone all the time. There was abuse that would happen. We would leave and stay at my grandparents' house. We left, I don't know, 100 times. And it wasn't just a magical 7. And it's one of these things that people don't really factor in, is there's all kinds of ways where people are leaving and seeking safety. But if there's not the support systems in the community, what options do you have? And you can't really sustain yourself or support yourself after that. And in the 2000s, people start looking at what really happens over a lifetime. And then they circled back to doing prevention work, because we're like, wait a minute, we're just doing a revolving door of services over and over again. And people are like, all right, so how do we really make some social change? And when people start saying, how are we really making homes safe? That's when we started to see more people come out and saying, well, there's all kinds of different issues. There's all kinds of other people experiencing violence. Male victims became a big topic in the early 2000s. I didn't really see a lot of heterosexual male victims. When I was the male advocate, I only saw just a handful of men a year. But then it switched to where we had a gay man become the male advocates. He's connected into the community. He saw a dozen men a month around male victims. And so when people say, what are the numbers? Are men not coming forward? There is the shame and embarrassment stigma around any type of abuse. But we all know that it happens. We are bad at intervening as community members. I was talking with this one woman, and she said, you know, if we can figure out how to change stuff in our homes, in our own families, we can figure out how to change things in community and society. And that's absolutely true. Our friends and family know about our problems. They just don't want to deal with it or don't know how to deal with it. We always tell friends what's going on in relationships, who have bad dating relationships, who had a bad experience. People just don't know how to handle that. And that's where we have bad responses. Because we know with sexual assault victims, that first time you disclose, that reaction you get from people is so critical. Because if someone says, whatever, or it's not that bad, or get over it, or are you sure? Like, that's one of the worst things you can absolutely say to anyone who says, I was sexually assaulted, or I think I was sexually assaulted. If you're passed out, there's always a self-doubt. There's always a self-doubt when something happens, because you're like, this is surreal. Did this really happen? You already questioned yourself anyway. And so when you had anything that adds to it, do you really want to come forward? And then you see things when people go to court. You hear people not go through with prosecutions, and then they say it's a false report. So all kinds of institutional responses that set out bad responses. Or you go to a place that has a service, or you look for a service, and it doesn't match what you need. If you don't have what I need, then it's not matching what I want. Why do I want to go through these three other things that you provide because that's what you want to put on paper and get your funding for, but it's not meeting what I need, so I'm going to go somewhere else. And so when people say, do people come forward all the time. It's just that they're not finding what's helpful and what's needed. When I think of healing most recently, one of the areas that I'm focused on a lot is how are people really helping themselves along in that healing journey? Questioning themselves, like what is going on? We see a lot of people react, and we see this out there in society. People don't ask why, they just react with their position. But when we look at some of the ways of reflection that come from our culture, different terms, different words, when someone says something or you see someone do something and you have a reaction inside of yourself, you're not supposed to jump on that person and change their behavior. You're supposed to go to it to yourself and say, why is it I am reacting to that? What's going on with me that I have that emotion to it? What's that attachment to it? Because that's one of our teachings in there that, we look at people as spiritual beings. All of our spirit is the same no matter what age we are. Whether you're an infant inside a ceremony, a teenager, or an old man in there, all of our spirits are the same size, no matter what. Our physical bodies may be the same size, so that's what we say. We're all spiritual beings. We all have gifts, all part of that balance. What do we all contribute? The lessons from infants and children are about honesty, forgiveness, joyfulness. That's what we do. That excitement, um, interest for adolescents, our responsibility, obligation as adults and as elders to be teachers and educators and pass that knowledge on to the next generation. So we always got to start with what it is with self and why are we reacting in the way that we do. And then also we need to learn how to take care of ourselves. So when we have something traumatic happen to us, we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that trauma in ways that's healthy. And that's the tools and things that we're hearing from people over the last couple of years of doing this project that's really interesting is what are the daily things that we have in our culture and teachings that we can use so that we know that we're going to always feel those emotions, but how do we handle that in a way that doesn't overwhelm us so that we're crippled and we can't do anything? And that's one of the lessons I've heard many years ago. You can't change the past, you can only change the way you look at it. And so when we look at a traumatic experience, that's an obstacle for us. But when we start to look at it from different angles and different sides, then we're taking different ways of this obstacle. And eventually you find yourself on the other side of it. And then you look back at it as an experience that drives you forward on your own healing journey.